The control tower at Denver International Airport fell silent when the voice came through the emergency frequency. Not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Every air traffic controller in the facility had heard thousands of voices over the years, panicked pilots, seasoned captains, nervous students taking their first solo flights. But this voice was different. It carried a weight that seemed to reach through the radio waves and settle directly into their chests. A resonance that made hardened professionals stop what they were doing and listen with an attention they couldn't explain. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Denver Control, this is backup vocalist Sarah Chun requesting immediate clearance to broadcast on emergency frequency 121.5. The duty supervisor, Marcus Rodriguez, stared at his headset as if it had suddenly grown wings. In 23 years of managing air traffic control operations, he had never received a request like this. Backup vocalist? Emergency frequency? The protocol manual he'd memorized cover to cover contained no provisions for singers, backup or otherwise, to access aviation communications. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to clarify your credentials and authority for this request," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the practiced calm of someone accustomed to managing chaos from a seated position. 40 feet above the ground, the woman's response came without hesitation, each word articulated with the precision of someone who understood that clarity could mean the difference between life and death. Authorization code Alpha 77 Whiskey Delta. Federal Aviation Administration Special Operations Division. I'm currently positioned at Red Rocks Amphitheater with direct line of sight to the storm system approaching from the northwest. Rodriguez's fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling up authorization databases that most controllers never accessed. The code she'd provided was real, active, and classified at a level that made his security clearance feel like a library card. But what stopped him cold wasn't the legitimacy of her credentials. It was the notation attached to the authorization. Voice Operations Specialist, Emergency Weather Communications, cleared for all frequencies during Category 4 storm events. Outside the tower windows, the approaching storm looked like something from a disaster movie. The wall of clouds stretched from horizon to horizon, a churning mass of gray and black that seemed to devour the landscape as it moved. Lightning flickered within its depths with a frequency that made the meteorologists in the National Weather Service office, 3 floors below, speak in hushed, worried tones. This wasn't just another Colorado thunderstorm. This was the kind of weather event that grounded entire fleets and sent pilots scurrying for the nearest airport like mice fleeing a burning building. But tonight, 43 aircraft were still airborne, caught between fuel calculations and rapidly deteriorating conditions. Commercial flights from Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami, and Seattle. Private jets carrying executives who couldn't afford delays. A medical transport helicopter with a heart patient whose life hung in the balance of reaching Denver General Hospital within the next hour. All of them flying blind through a storm system that was rewriting the rules of meteorology with each passing minute. Sarah Chun stood on the backstage platform at Red Rocks, her backup singer's uniform black dress, comfortable shoes, hair pulled back in a practical bun, making her nearly invisible among the crew members, who scurried around preparing for a concert that would never happen. The headliner, platinum-selling recording artist Madison Williams, had fled to her tour bus the moment the first drops of rain began to fall, leaving Sarah and the rest of the backup vocals to help with equipment breakdown. It was a familiar position, present but unnoticed, essential but unacknowledged, ready but rarely chosen. The wireless headset she wore looked identical to the ones used by the other performers, but its internal components told a different story. While her colleagues' headsets connected to the venue's sound system, Sarah's linked directly to a secure federal communications network that most people didn't know existed. The small device clipped to her belt appeared to be a standard wireless pack, but the frequencies it could access would have impressed the technicians at NOAA's Storm Prediction Center. As the storm approached, Sarah had been monitoring aviation frequencies with the casual efficiency of someone reading a familiar book. She listened to the growing desperation in pilots' voices as visibility dropped to zero, heard the strain in air traffic controllers' communications as they tried to manage an impossible situation with inadequate tools. The storm was moving faster than predicted, its electromagnetic activity interfering with navigation systems in ways that made standard instrument approaches as reliable as coin flips. The Red Rocks venue, carved into the natural amphitheater of the Colorado Mountains, provided an acoustic environment unlike anywhere else on Earth. The sandstone formations that made it famous for concerts also created unique sound propagation characteristics that Sarah had studied with the dedication of a doctoral candidate. Every curve of rock, every angle of stone, every atmospheric condition affected how sound waves traveled through space. Tonight, with the storm creating specific pressure differentials and the electromagnetic interference clearing certain frequency bands while blocking others, the amphitheater had become something unprecedented, a natural acoustic relay station capable of reaching aircraft across a 500-mile radius. Sarah's education at the Berklee College of Music had covered the technical aspects of sound engineering, but her real expertise came from a different source entirely. During her junior year, she had participated in a joint research project between the music department and the MIT Acoustics Laboratory, studying how human vocal frequencies could be modified to penetrate atmospheric interference. What started as an academic exercise in sound wave propagation had evolved into something the Federal Aviation Administration took very seriously indeed. The project had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Dr. James Harrison, a former NASA communications engineer turned academic researcher, had been studying the acoustic properties of natural formations for potential applications in emergency communications. When he heard Sarah's voice during a routine demonstration of the Berklee MIT project, he immediately recognized something that went far beyond musical talent. Her vocal range included frequencies that could cut through electromagnetic interference like a lighthouse beam penetrating fog. 3 years of classified research followed. Sarah learned to modulate her voice to specific frequencies, to project sound waves that could bounce off atmospheric layers and reach receivers hundreds of miles away, to speak in tones that remained clear even when transmitted through equipment damaged by severe weather. The training took place at remote facilities in Montana and Nevada, places where the Federal Aviation Administration tested experimental communication systems, away from public scrutiny. But tonight was different. Tonight, the theoretical became an urgent reality as 43 aircraft found themselves trapped in a storm that was proving more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The electromagnetic interference was beyond anything in the training scenarios. Standard radio communications were failing. GPS systems were providing contradictory information, and the pilots were flying on instruments that had become as reliable as weather vanes in a hurricane. Sarah's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. From Dr. Harrison, NOAA confirms storm exceeds all modeling parameters. Standard aviation communications were compromised across the entire front range. You're cleared for emergency protocols. Good luck. She looked out at the storm, now close enough that individual lightning strikes were visible as distinct electrical events rather than a continuous flicker. The wind was beginning to affect the sound propagation patterns she had calculated, but the interference was also clearing frequency bands that were normally cluttered with civilian radio traffic. The acoustic sweet spot she had identified during her research was opening up, creating a window of opportunity that might not last long. The backup singer's position at Red Rocks had been more than a job, it had been cover for the real work she was trained to do. While audiences focused on the headliners commanding center stage, Sarah had been studying the acoustic properties of the venue, taking precise measurements of how sound traveled through the natural amphitheater under different atmospheric conditions. Every concert had been a data collection opportunity, every performance a chance to refine her understanding of how human voice could be used as a precision instrument for emergency communications. Her colleagues in the music industry saw her as talented but unremarkable, someone whose voice blended seamlessly into the background harmonies that made headliners sound better. They didn't know that her vocal training included techniques developed for military communications specialists, or that her understanding of frequency modulation came from studying how radar operators maintained contact with aircraft during electronic warfare scenarios. The stage manager, Craig Peterson, approached her with the harried expression of someone whose well-organized event had just been derailed by forces beyond anyone's control. "Sarah, we're shutting down. Madison's already gone, and the weather service is saying this storm is going to be worse than anything we've seen in years. You should head to the parking structure before it gets really bad." Sarah nodded but didn't move toward the exit. Instead, she turned toward the approaching storm, her trained ear already picking up the subtle changes in atmospheric pressure that would affect sound propagation. "Craig, I need to stay for a few more minutes. There's something I need to check with the venue's acoustic setup." Peterson looked at her with the expression of someone who had learned not to question the quirks of professional musicians. "Your call, but don't wait too long. Security is clearing the area in 20 minutes whether you're ready or not." As he walked away, Sarah activated her specialized headset and began running through the vocal exercises that had been drilled into her during 3 years of classified training. Her voice needed to be at peak performance for what was coming, and there would be no second chances if the window of opportunity closed before she was ready. The storm was 15 minutes away from Red Rocks, and 43 aircraft were running out of options. In control towers across Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska, air traffic controllers were watching their screens with the growing realization that their standard procedures were inadequate for what was developing. Pilots trained to handle emergency situations were finding themselves in circumstances that exceeded their training, flying aircraft through weather that was rewriting the physics of aviation with each passing mile, and on a stage carved into the Colorado mountains, a backup singer was preparing to use her voice in ways that no performer in the venue's 50-year history had ever imagined. The electromagnetic interference that was crippling aviation communications had created an acoustic window that existed only during specific atmospheric conditions, and Sarah Chun was the only person in the world trained to use it. The Federal Aviation Administration's Special Operations Division had theoretical protocols for this exact scenario, but theory and practice were separated by the difference between reading about flying and actually piloting an aircraft through a Category 4 storm. Tonight, the backup singer would discover whether 3 years of classified training and a lifetime of vocal preparation had equipped her for a challenge that existed at the intersection of meteorology, acoustics, and life-or-death decision-making. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her voice had guided audiences through complex harmonies, supported headliners through demanding performances, and provided the foundation for musical arrangements that touched millions of listeners. But none of that would matter if she couldn't use it to guide 43 aircraft safely through a storm that was proving to be unlike anything in the recorded history of American aviation. The backup singer stepped forward, her position on the stage no longer about supporting other performers, but about becoming the primary voice that would determine whether 43 flights would land safely or become statistics in aviation safety reports. The storm was coming, the pilots were waiting, and Sarah Chun was about to discover whether being relegated to the background had actually been preparation for the moment, when she would need to step forward and command attention in ways that no backup singer in history had ever imagined. 3 hours before the storm arrived, Sarah Chun had been standing in her usual position, stage left, second row, directly behind the lead vocalist's microphone stand were the lighting designers. Spots never quite reached. The Red Rocks rehearsal had been running for 6 hours, and Madison Williams was having what her management team diplomatically called an artistic moment, which meant she was screaming at everyone within a 50-foot radius about microphone. Levels that sounded identical to everyone except her. The harmonies are muddy. Madison's voice carried across the amphitheater with the kind of projection that made Sarah wonder why they needed amplification systems at all. I can't hear myself. Think with all that background noise cluttering up my sound space. Background noise. That's what Madison called the carefully orchestrated vocal arrangements that Sarah and 3 other backup singers had spent weeks perfecting. Each harmony line was precisely calculated to enhance Madison's natural vocal range while covering the frequency gaps where her voice tended to thin out during the more demanding passages. Sarah had written most of the arrangements herself, studying Madison's vocal patterns with the attention to detail that a jeweler might use to cut a diamond. But credit for the musical direction went to the lead sound engineer, who nodded along with Madison's complaints as if they made perfect sense. Maybe we should try it with just Madison on the chorus, suggested Tommy Rivera, the tour's musical director, his voice carrying the weary patience of someone who had learned to navigate the ego dynamics of major recording artists. Keep it simple, let her voice really shine through. Sarah exchanged a quick glance with the other backup singers, Jessica Park, Amanda Foster, and Carla Martinez, all accomplished vocalists in their own right, who had learned to swallow their pride in exchange for steady paychecks and the chance to perform at venues like Red Rocks. They had heard variations of this conversation at every major venue on the tour. Madison's insecurity about sharing vocal space was as predictable as the Colorado weather, which was to say completely unpredictable, but somehow always disruptive. The problem isn't the arrangement, Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound technicians adjusting equipment levels. The monitor mix is emphasizing the mid-range frequencies where Madison's voice naturally sits. If we roll off some of the 2K to 4000 range on the backup mics and boost the fundamental frequencies, she'll hear more separation without us having to change the actual harmonies. Tommy looked at her with the expression of someone who had just heard a janitor explain quantum physics. Sarah's technical knowledge often caught people off guard, partly because backup singers weren't expected to understand sound engineering, and partly because she had a habit of offering solutions that required more acoustic knowledge than most musicians possessed. That's pretty specific technical stuff, Sarah, Tommy said, his tone carrying the kind of dismissive politeness that made it clear he hadn't really processed what she'd said. Let's just focus on the musical elements and let the sound crew handle the technical side. Madison, who had been arguing with her personal assistant about the temperature of her herbal tea, suddenly turned her attention back to the backup singers. Honestly, I don't know why we need 4 people doing harmonies anyway. This isn't a gospel choir. I'm the reason people buy tickets, not the supporting cast. The comment stung not because it was cruel, but because it revealed how completely Madison misunderstood the role that backup vocals played in her own success. Sarah had analyzed recordings of Madison's live performances from before she had professional backup singers, and the difference was dramatic. Without harmonic support, Madison's voice tended to waver on sustained notes. Her pitch became unreliable during complex melodic passages, and her overall sound lacked the fullness that made her recordings so compelling. But pointing out these technical realities would have been career suicide. The music industry operated on a delicate ecosystem of egos and insecurities, where the people who made stars sound better were expected to remain invisible and grateful for the privilege. Sarah had learned this lesson early in her career, watching Talented musicians get blacklisted for the crime of being too knowledgeable or too assertive about their contributions. Of course, Madison, Sarah replied, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality that had become second nature during her 3 years on the tour. Whatever you think works best for the show. What Madison didn't know was that Sarah's understanding of acoustics went far beyond anything taught in traditional music programs. While her colleagues had spent their college years studying performance techniques and music theory, Sarah had been attending additional classes at the Colorado School of Mines, learning about wave propagation and atmospheric physics from professors who consulted for aerospace companies and government research facilities. The dual education had been exhausting but necessary. Dr. Harrison's research project required participants who understood both the artistic and scientific aspects of vocal performance, people who could apply acoustic engineering principles while maintaining the musical sensitivity that made performances emotionally compelling. Sarah had been one of only 12 students selected for the program nationwide, chosen not just for her vocal abilities, but for her demonstrated aptitude in mathematics and physics. During her sophomore year at Berkeley, while her classmates were focusing on jazz improvisation and music business classes, Sarah had been studying how sound waves behaved in different atmospheric conditions. She learned about frequency modulation, signal processing, and the acoustic properties of natural formations. Her professors at the School of Mines taught her to think of her voice not just as a musical instrument, but as a precision communication tool capable of reaching listeners across vast distances under specific conditions. The training had been conducted in absolute secrecy. Sarah's fellow music students believed she was taking electives in audio engineering, a reasonable explanation for someone interested in the technical side of recording. The reality was more complex. She was learning to use her voice as a navigational aid for aircraft operating in conditions where traditional communication systems failed. Dr. Harrison had explained the applications during one of their early meetings in his laboratory at the School of Mines. The human voice can produce frequencies that penetrate atmospheric interference in ways that electronic systems cannot replicate, he had said, gesturing toward charts that showed sound wave propagation patterns during severe weather events. But it requires precise training to modulate vocal output to specific frequencies while maintaining clarity across extended ranges. The training scenarios had been unlike anything in traditional vocal coaching. Sarah learned to project her voice to precise frequency bands, to maintain consistent tone and pitch while speaking at volumes that could reach listeners miles away, to modulate her vocal patterns to cut through the kind of electromagnetic interference that disabled radio communications during severe storms. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of the training was learning to live with the knowledge that her real purpose remained hidden from everyone around her. Her colleagues in the music industry saw her as a competent but unremarkable backup singer, someone whose technical knowledge was interesting, but not particularly relevant to the business of entertainment. They had no idea that she was one of a handful of people in the world trained to provide emergency communications during aviation crises. The cover identity was perfect precisely because it was so ordinary. Backup singers were expected to be present but unnoticed, skilled but deferential, ready to perform but content to remain in the background. The role provided access to venues with unique acoustic properties while maintaining the kind of anonymity that intelligence agencies valued in their operational assets. Red Rocks had been the primary reason Sarah had accepted the position with Madison's tour. The venue's natural acoustic properties made it an ideal testing ground for long-range vocal communication techniques, and the concert schedule provided regular opportunities to study how sound traveled through the amphitheater under different atmospheric conditions. Over the past 2 years, Sarah had performed at Red Rocks 17 times, collecting data on wind patterns, temperature variations, and electromagnetic interference levels that would have impressed meteorologists at the National Weather Service. Each performance had been an opportunity to refine her understanding of how the venue's acoustic properties could be utilized for emergency communications. She had calculated the optimal positions for sound projection, identified the frequency bands that traveled most effectively through the natural rock formations, and studied how different weather conditions affected sound propagation patterns. Tonight's concert was supposed to be her final data collection opportunity before the tour moved on to venues in California and Nevada. She had planned to spend the sound check period taking precise measurements of how the approaching storm system affected the amphitheater's acoustic characteristics, research that would be valuable for future emergency protocols. Instead, she was watching Madison Williams have a meltdown about microphone placement while 43 aircraft approached the most dangerous weather system to hit the Colorado Front Range in recorded history. "Places, everyone," called the stage manager, his voice cutting through the ongoing drama about backup singer positioning. "We're going to run through the full set one more time before the weather gets too bad." Sarah took her position, adjusting the specialized headset that looked identical to the standard wireless equipment used by the other performers. The device felt heavier tonight, loaded with the knowledge that it might soon be used for something far more important than supporting Madison Williams through another performance of her platinum-selling album. The other backup singers chatted quietly among themselves, discussing dinner plans and speculation about whether the approaching storm would force them to cancel the show. Their concerns were ordinary, immediate, the kind of workplace conversations that happened in every industry. They worried about lost income from a canceled performance, about travel logistics if flights were delayed, about whether their hotels had reliable room service. Sarah's concerns operated on a different scale entirely. She was monitoring weather reports from the National Weather Service, tracking the storm's movement with the precision of someone whose specialized training had taught her to read atmospheric conditions like a road map. The electromagnetic interference patterns were developing exactly as the theoretical models had predicted, creating communication blackouts that would leave aircraft flying blind through weather that exceeded the design parameters of their navigation systems. The irony wasn't lost on her. While Madison complained about background noise cluttering her sound space, Sarah was preparing to use her voice to cut through atmospheric interference that was disabling multi-billion-dollar communication systems. While her colleagues worried about maintaining their positions in the entertainment industry hierarchy, Sarah was contemplating whether her years of specialized training had adequately prepared her for a scenario that existed at the intersection of meteorology, acoustics, and life-or-death decision-making. As the rehearsal continued, Sarah performed her backup vocals with the automatic precision that came from countless hours of practice, but her attention was focused on the approaching storm. The wind patterns were shifting in ways that would affect sound propagation through the amphitheater, creating both challenges and opportunities for long-range vocal communication. The electromagnetic interference was clearing frequency bands that were normally cluttered with civilian radio traffic, opening up acoustic windows that existed only during specific atmospheric conditions. The backup singer was about to discover whether being underestimated had actually been the perfect preparation for a moment when the entire success of an emergency operation would depend on someone who had spent years being told that her voice was just background noise. In control towers across the region, air traffic controllers were beginning to realize that their standard communication systems were failing in ways that their training manuals hadn't covered. Pilots were reporting GPS malfunctions, radio interference, and navigation equipment failures that suggested the approaching storm was something unprecedented in the history of commercial aviation. And at Red Rocks Amphitheater, while the rest of the music industry focused on Madison Williams' performance, Sarah Chun was making final preparations to use her voice in ways that no backup singer in history had ever imagined. The specialized training was about to be tested in real-world conditions that would determine whether 3 years of classified education had equipped her to save 43 aircraft from a storm that was proving more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The discovery began with a coffee stain on a classified document that should never have existed in the first place. Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, atmospheric physicist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, had been working 16-hour days analyzing the unprecedented storm system approaching Colorado when she accidentally knocked over her mug while reaching for a secure telephone. The dark liquid spread across her desk, seeping under papers and threatening to destroy weeks of meteorological calculations. As she frantically lifted documents away from the spreading coffee, one page caught her attention, not because of its official letterhead or classification markings, but because of a handwritten notation in the margin that seemed utterly out of place among the technical weather data. In neat, precise handwriting, someone had written, "Acoustic propagation optimal during electromagnetic interference events. Refer to Chun research protocols." Dr. Vasquez had spent her entire career studying how atmospheric conditions affected communication systems. She knew every researcher in the field, every government project dealing with emergency communications, every academic paper published on the subject of weather-related signal interference. But she had never heard of any Chun research protocols, and the reference didn't match any program in the federal databases she had clearance to access. The notation was written in blue ink, the kind that comes from an expensive fountain pen rather than government-issue ballpoint pens. The handwriting was distinctive, flowing but controlled, the kind that suggested someone with both artistic training and scientific precision. Most intriguingly, the notation was dated just 6 months ago, indicating that whatever the Chen research protocols were, they were current and apparently relevant to the approaching storm. Dr. Vasquez had built her reputation on being thorough, a quality that had earned her positions with NASA, NOAA, and finally the National Center for Atmospheric Research. When something didn't make sense, she investigated until it did, even when that investigation led her into classified territories that made her security clearance officer nervous. Her first call was to Dr. Patricia Morrison at the Federal Aviation Administration's Technical Center in New Jersey. Patricia had been her graduate school roommate at MIT, and their friendship had survived 3 decades of career moves, security clearances, and the kind of professional competition that destroyed most academic relationships. "Patricia, I need to ask you about something that might be classified," Dr. Vasquez said without preamble when her friend answered the phone. "Have you ever heard of Chun research protocols related to acoustic propagation during electromagnetic interference events?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough for Dr. Vasquez to wonder if the connection had been lost. When Patricia finally spoke, her voice carried a careful neutrality that meant she was choosing her words with the precision of someone who knew that certain conversations were monitored by agencies with impressive technical capabilities. "Eleanor, where exactly did you come across that reference?" "In documentation related to the storm system we're tracking." "Patricia, this thing is going to be unlike anything we've seen before. The electromagnetic interference alone is going to disable communication systems across a 500-mile radius. If there are emergency protocols that I don't know about, I need to understand them before this storm makes landfall." Another pause, shorter this time, but weighted with the kind of consideration that suggested Patricia was consulting internal protocols about what information could be shared with colleagues at other agencies. "The Chun protocols are real," Patricia said finally, "but they're not what you think they are. Eleanor, can you get to a secure line in the next 10 minutes? This conversation needs to happen through official channels." 20 minutes later, Dr. Vasquez was seated in the secure communications room at NCAR, a windowless space lined with copper mesh that blocked electronic surveillance and made her feel like she was sitting inside a microwave oven. The secure video conference connection showed Patricia Morrison in a similar room at the FAA Technical Center, her face illuminated by the cold fluorescent lighting that seem to be standard in government facilities designed for sensitive conversations. What I'm about to tell you is classified at levels that require you to sign additional non-disclosure agreements. Patricia began, sliding a thick document across her desk toward a camera that transmitted the image to Dr. Vasquez's screen. The Chun protocols aren't research in the traditional sense. They're operational procedures developed by someone named Sarah Chun, who may be the only person in the country trained to provide emergency communications during severe electromagnetic interference events. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward, her scientific curiosity overriding her concerns about security classifications. What kind of emergency communications? Are we talking about some kind of specialized radio equipment? Vocal, Patricia said simply. Sarah Chun is trained to use her voice as a communication system that can penetrate atmospheric interference when electronic systems fail. She's essentially a human radio transmitter with the ability to reach aircraft across hundreds of miles during specific weather conditions. The concept was so far outside conventional understanding of communication technology that Dr. Vasquez's first instinct was to assume her friend was joking. But Patricia's expression carried the seriousness of someone discussing matters of national security, and the official documentation visible on her desk suggested that this conversation was as real as the approaching storm. Patricia, that's impossible. The human voice doesn't have the power output necessary to reach aircraft at operational altitudes, especially during severe weather events. Under normal circumstances, you'd be correct, Patricia replied. But Sarah Chun doesn't operate under normal circumstances. She's trained to utilize natural acoustic amplification system-specific geographical formations that can focus and project vocal frequencies across vast distances. The training program was developed jointly by the FAA, MIT, and the Colorado School of Mines based on research into how natural formations can be used for emergency communications. Dr. Vasquez pulled up topographical maps on her secondary monitor, cross-referencing the storm's projected path with locations that might have the acoustic properties Patricia was describing. One location stood out immediately: Red Rocks Amphitheater, a natural sandstone formation that had been studied extensively for its unique sound propagation characteristics. Red Rocks, she said, more to herself than to Patricia. The acoustic properties of that formation during specific atmospheric conditions could theoretically amplify vocal frequencies in ways that ... Patricia, is Sarah Chun at Red Rocks right now? That's need-to-know information, Eleanor, and right now, you don't need to know her specific location. What you need to know is that if the storm develops as your models predict, we may need to activate emergency protocols that go beyond anything in our standard disaster response procedures. Dr. Vasquez spent the next hour reviewing classified documents that redefined her understanding of emergency communications. The Chun protocols outline procedures for using human vocal frequencies to guide aircraft during communication blackouts, techniques that had been tested in laboratory conditions, but never deployed during actual emergency situations. The research behind the protocols was impressive, combining advanced acoustic engineering with meteorological modeling and aviation safety requirements. But what struck her most was the profile of Sarah Chun herself. According to the documents, she was a graduate of both the Berklee College of Music and the Colorado School of Mines, someone who had somehow combined artistic training with advanced technical education. Her vocal abilities had been quantified with the precision normally reserved for military equipment: frequency range, projection distance, modulation capabilities, endurance under stress conditions. The psychological profile was equally detailed. Sarah Chun was described as someone with exceptional ability to remain calm under pressure, demonstrated leadership capabilities, and the kind of analytical intelligence that allowed her to process complex information while performing demanding physical tasks. But perhaps most importantly, She had proven ability to operate effectively while maintaining cover identities that concealed her true capabilities. Patricia, according to these documents, Sarah Chun has been maintaining a civilian cover identity for 3 years. What kind of cover allows someone with these capabilities to remain hidden while staying ready for emergency deployment? Think about it, Eleanor. What kind of job would give someone regular access to venues with unique acoustic properties while requiring them to remain inconspicuous and technically proficient? The answer came to Dr. Vasquez like a revelation that recontextualized everything she thought she knew about the entertainment industry. She's a performer, someone whose job requires them to understand sound systems, work in various venues, and remain in the background while supporting higher-profile individuals. Sarah Chun is a backup singer on a major touring production. Tonight she's scheduled to perform at Red Rocks Amphitheater, approximately 15 miles from where your storm models show the most severe electromagnetic interference will occur. Dr. Vasquez looked at her weather tracking displays with new understanding. The storm system approaching Colorado wasn't just a meteorological event. It was a potential test of emergency communication protocols that existed at the intersection of acoustic science, atmospheric physics, and human performance capabilities. Patricia, if this storm develops as we expect, how many aircraft could potentially be affected by communication failures? Current projections show 43 aircraft in the potential impact zone. Commercial flights, private aircraft, medical transports, and military training flights. If the electromagnetic interference reaches the levels your models predict, those aircraft will be flying blind through weather conditions that exceed their operational parameters. The weight of the situation settled over Dr. Vasquez like a physical presence. 43 aircraft meant potentially thousands of lives, depending on communication systems that were about to fail in ways that standard emergency procedures couldn't address. The only backup system was a backup singer whose existence was so classified that most of the people responsible for aviation safety had never heard of her. What happens if the Chun protocols fail? Dr. Vasquez asked, though she already knew the answer. Then we hope that 43 aircraft can navigate through the worst storm in Colorado history using instruments that were never designed to function during this level of electromagnetic interference, Patricia replied. Eleanor, this isn't just about testing experimental communication procedures. This is about whether one person's voice can make the difference between a successful emergency response and a disaster that reshapes how we think about aviation safety. As the secure video conference ended, Dr. Vasquez remained in the copper-lined communications room, studying weather data with the knowledge that her meteorological calculations would determine whether Sarah Chun's specialized training would be tested under real-world conditions. The storm was 6 hours away from Red Rocks, and 43 aircraft were about to discover whether their pilots' training had prepared them for weather that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional aviation experience. The backup singer's secret was out, at least among the handful of people with security clearances high enough to access information about emergency communication protocols that most government officials didn't know existed. But knowledge of Sarah Chun's capabilities was meaningless without the atmospheric conditions necessary to activate those capabilities, and those conditions were currently developing in ways that would test the limits of both meteorological science and human performance. Dr. Vasquez returned to her weather monitoring stations with new appreciation for how many elements had to align perfectly for the Chun protocols to function as designed. The storm had to create specific electromagnetic interference patterns. The atmospheric pressure had to develop particular acoustic propagation characteristics, and Sarah Chun had to be positioned at Red Rocks during the precise window when those conditions intersected. If any of those elements failed to materialize, 43 aircraft would be facing the worst storm in Colorado history, with communication systems that were already beginning to show signs of interference failure. The backup singer would remain in the background, her extraordinary capabilities unused, while conventional emergency procedures tried to handle a situation that exceeded their design parameters. But if everything aligned as the classified protocols predicted, the world was about to witness something unprecedented: a human voice, cutting through electromagnetic interference to guide aircraft safely through weather that had defeated every electronic communication system in the region. The first aircraft to report serious trouble was Atlantic Airways Flight 447, a Boeing 767 carrying 238 passengers from Miami to Denver, with fuel reserves calculated down to the minute. Captain Rebecca Torres had been flying commercial aircraft for 19 years, accumulating over 12,000 flight hours without a single incident that required emergency protocols. But as Flight 447 approached Colorado airspace at 37,000 feet, her instrument panel began displaying information that contradicted every principle of aviation physics she had spent 2 decades mastering. Denver Control, Atlantic 447 requesting immediate assistance. Captain Torres transmitted, her voice maintaining the professional calm that passengers expected, even as her primary navigation systems showed her aircraft simultaneously at 3 different locations, none of which matched the coordinates displayed on her backup instruments. We're experiencing complete GPS failure, compass deviation beyond acceptable parameters, and our weather radar is showing returns that don't match any pattern in our meteorological database. In the Denver International Airport Control Tower, Supervisor Marcus Rodriguez watched his screens with growing alarm as Flight 447's transponder signal began flickering erratically, appearing and disappearing in patterns that suggested electromagnetic interference beyond anything in his 23 years of air traffic control experience. The storm approaching from the northwest was affecting aircraft navigation systems in ways that the Federal Aviation Administration's emergency procedures manual didn't address. Atlantic 447, Denver Control. We're tracking your position, but we're showing inconsistent radar returns. Can you confirm your current altitude and heading using backup instruments? Captain Torres consulted instruments that were providing contradictory information with the confidence of expensive equipment that had never malfunctioned before. Denver Control, our backup altimeter shows 37,200 feet. Primary altimeter shows 34,800 feet, and our GPS altitude readout is indicating 41,000 feet. Navigation compass bearing is 285 degrees, but our gyroscopic compass shows 302 degrees. We're flying on best guess and visual reference points. Rodriguez felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with managing aviation emergencies. But this situation was unlike anything in his experience. Standard protocol for navigation equipment failure involved vectoring aircraft using ground-based radar systems, but the electromagnetic interference from the approaching storm was creating blind spots in coverage that made precision guidance impossible. Atlantic 447, we're going to vector you toward alternative routing that should take you around the worst of the interference. Turn left heading 240 degrees, descend and maintain 35,000 feet. But before Captain Torres could acknowledge the instruction, her radio filled with static so intense that Rodriguez's voice became unintelligible. The electromagnetic interference that Dr. Vasquez's weather models had predicted was beginning to affect communication systems across the entire Front Range region, creating conditions that no air traffic control procedure had been designed to handle. Within the next 47 minutes, 36 additional aircraft reported similar navigation and communication difficulties. United Flight 8093 from Chicago found its autopilot system disconnecting randomly as conflicting GPS signals confused the aircraft's computer systems. Southwest Flight 2156 from Los Angeles reported that its weather radar was showing storm cells that appeared to be moving in impossible directions at speeds that violated fundamental meteorological principles. A private Learjet carrying pharmaceutical executives from Phoenix to Denver discovered that its emergency beacon was activating spontaneously, broadcasting distress signals that overwhelmed nearby frequencies. The situation escalated beyond routine emergency management when life flight 7. A medical helicopter transporting a heart attack patient from Vail to Denver General Hospital reported complete electrical system failure while flying through what should have been clear airspace 50 miles from the storm front. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Life Flight 7 declaring an emergency. We've lost all electrical power, including backup systems. Flying on manual controls with approximately 12 minutes of fuel remaining. Patient condition critical. We need immediate guidance to the nearest suitable landing area. Life Flight pilot Michael Chun, no relation to Sarah, despite the shared surname, had accumulated over 3,000 hours, flying medical transport missions in some of the most challenging terrain in Colorado. His training included procedures for engine failure, severe weather encounters, and navigation equipment malfunctions. But complete electrical failure during electromagnetic interference created a situation that combined multiple emergency scenarios into something that exceeded the boundaries of standard helicopter pilot training. Rodriguez coordinated with emergency services to identify potential landing sites within Life Flight 7's fuel range, but the electromagnetic interference was affecting ground-based navigation beacons that helicopters relied on for precision approaches to unfamiliar landing areas. The closest hospital helipad was at Denver General, but reaching it required flying through the electromagnetic interference zone that had already disabled the aircraft's navigation systems. Life Flight 7, Denver Control. We're going to attempt to guide you using ground-based radar tracking, but we need to advise you that our coverage is intermittent due to atmospheric interference. Are you able to maintain visual flight references? Denver Control, visibility is decreasing rapidly. We're encountering cloud formations that don't match any weather briefing we received. The electromagnetic effects seem to be creating atmospheric disturbances that are affecting visibility conditions. The realization hit Rodriguez with the force of a physical blow. The storm wasn't just creating electromagnetic interference. It was generating atmospheric effects that were beyond the scope of conventional meteorological prediction. The pilots weren't just dealing with navigation equipment failures. They were flying through weather conditions that didn't exist in any training manual or emergency procedure guide. Vasquez secure phone rang in the NCAR facility as she monitored the storm's development through satellite imagery that showed electromagnetic activity patterns unlike anything in the historical weather database. The caller identification showed a number that belonged to the FAA as Emergency Operations Center, a facility that handled aviation crises requiring coordination between multiple government agencies. Dr. Vasquez, this is Director James Sullivan. At FAA Emergency Operations, we understand you've been briefed on certain classified communication protocols related to the current weather emergency. Director Sullivan, I've been monitoring the storm's development. The electromagnetic interference is exceeding our most severe projections. How many aircraft are currently affected? 43 aircraft are reporting various degrees of navigation and communication difficulties. We've got commercial flights carrying over 6,000 passengers, medical transports with critical patients, and private aircraft with fuel reserves that don't allow for extended holds or diversions to alternate airports. Dr. Vasquez studied her atmospheric models with the knowledge that the Chen protocols had been designed for exactly this scenario. Electromagnetic interference was creating communication blackouts across a region spanning 3 states, while simultaneously generating the specific atmospheric conditions that could make long-range vocal communication possible. Director Sullivan, The atmospheric conditions are developing exactly as the theoretical models predicted. The electromagnetic interference that's disabling your communication systems is also clearing frequency bands that could potentially be used for alternative communication methods. Dr. Vasquez, we need you to coordinate with certain specialized assets that may be able to provide emergency communication services under these specific conditions. Can you confirm that Red Rock's amphitheater is within the optimal acoustic range for the specialized protocols we discussed? The question forced Dr. Vasquez to confront the reality that 43 aircraft might be depending on communication techniques that existed at the intersection of atmospheric science and human performance capabilities. The theoretical research that had seemed academically interesting now represented the only backup communication system available during an aviation emergency that was exceeding all conventional response procedures. Director Sullivan, the acoustic propagation models show that Red Rocks could theoretically provide the amplification necessary for long-range vocal communication, but only if atmospheric conditions align precisely with the acoustic characteristics of the natural formation. We're talking about a communication window that might exist for only a limited time period. Dr. Vasquez, we have 43 aircraft carrying thousands of people flying through the worst electromagnetic interference event in aviation history. Conventional communication systems are failing across a 3-state region. If the specialized protocols you've been briefed on can provide any assistance, we need to activate them immediately. The weight of the decision settled over Dr. Vasquez like a physical presence. Her meteorological calculations had predicted this scenario, but predicting and experiencing were separated by the difference between theoretical knowledge and life or death responsibility. If the Chun protocols failed, 43 aircraft would be flying blind through weather that was proving more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Director Sullivan, based on current atmospheric conditions, I believe the acoustic window for specialized communication protocols will open within the next 23 minutes. The electromagnetic interference patterns are creating exactly the conditions necessary for long-range vocal transmission, but the window will be limited by the storm's movement and the stability of the atmospheric pressure differentials. At Red Rock's amphitheater, Sarah Chun stood on the stage that had been evacuated by everyone except essential security personnel. The concert had been officially canceled 30 minutes ago, but she had remained behind using her specialized equipment to monitor aviation frequencies as the crisis developed. Her training had included scenarios similar to what was developing, but hearing real pilots reporting navigation failures while flying through potentially fatal weather conditions created a level of psychological pressure that no simulation could replicate. Her secure communication device displayed a message from Dr. Harrison, FAA Emergency Operations, requesting activation of Chun protocols. 43 aircraft in distress. Atmospheric conditions optimal for long-range vocal transmission. Authorization code transmitted separately. Good luck. Sarah looked out at the approaching storm, now close enough that individual lightning strikes were visible as distinct electrical events rather than a continuous flicker. The electromagnetic interference that was crippling aviation communication systems had created the exact atmospheric conditions that her training had been designed to exploit. The acoustic sweet spot she had calculated during 2 years of data collection at Red Rocks was opening up, creating a communication window that might save 43 aircraft or might prove inadequate for the most challenging emergency communication scenario ever attempted. The backup singer stepped toward the microphone system that she had secretly modified to access federal communication frequencies, knowing that the next hour would determine whether 3 years of classified training had prepared her for a challenge that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional emergency response procedures. 43 aircraft were flying through impossible weather. Their pilots were navigating with instruments that provided contradictory information. And Sarah Chun was about to discover whether her voice could cut through electromagnetic interference that had defeated every electronic communication system in the region. The crisis had reached the point where conventional solutions were inadequate, and the impossible had become the only option left. The moment that changed everything began with silence. Not the absence of sound, but the profound quiet that settled over every aviation frequency when Sarah Chun's voice first cut through the electromagnetic chaos that had been terrorizing pilots across 3 states. In control towers from Denver to Cheyenne to Colorado Springs, air traffic controllers who had been shouting instructions into static-filled radios suddenly stopped speaking, their attention captured by a transmission unlike anything in their professional experience. All aircraft experiencing navigation difficulties in Colorado airspace. This is Emergency Communications Specialist Chen. Authorization code Alpha-7-7-Whiskey-Delta. Broadcasting from Red Rock's Emergency Communications Station on frequency 121.5. Captain Rebecca Torres was the first to respond, her voice carrying the desperate relief of someone who had been flying blind for 27 minutes while her instruments provided contradictory information that made navigation feel like guesswork. Emergency Communications. This is Atlantic 447. We've been unable to establish reliable contact with Denver Control. Can you confirm our position and provide guidance? Sarah's response came with a clarity that seemed to pierce the electromagnetic interference like sunlight cutting through storm clouds. Her voice carried frequencies that remained crisp and intelligible despite the atmospheric chaos that had rendered standard radio communications nearly useless. Atlantic 447, I have you on scope. You're currently 17 miles northwest of Denver International Airport at 36,800 feet, tracking southeast at 340 knots. Your position is stable despite instrument irregularities. Be advised that electromagnetic interference is affecting your navigation systems, but your actual flight path is safe and clear of terrain obstacles. In the Denver control tower, Marcus Rodriguez stared at his radar screen with growing amazement. Sarah Chun's position assessment of Atlantic 447 was accurate to within hundreds of feet, despite the fact that his own radar systems were showing inconsistent returns due to the electromagnetic interference. More incredibly, she was somehow tracking aircraft positions without access to the sophisticated radar arrays that air traffic control relied on for precision guidance. Emergency Communications. This is Life Flight 7, came the urgent transmission from the medical helicopter that had been flying with complete electrical failure. We're down to 8 minutes of fuel with a critical patient aboard. We need immediate guidance to Denver General Hospital helipad. Sarah's voice took on a different quality, still calm and professional, but with an undertone of focused intensity that suggested she was processing complex information at incredible speed. Life Flight 7, I'm tracking your position at 6,200 feet, 12 miles southwest of Denver General. You're going to turn right heading 085 degrees and begin a gradual descent to 5,800 feet. In approximately 3 minutes, you'll see the hospital complex lights through a break in the cloud cover at your 2 o'clock position. Michael Chun, the life flight pilot, followed the instructions with the precision of someone who had no other options. As his helicopter turned onto the new heading, the cloud cover that had been obscuring all ground references suddenly parted exactly as the voice had predicted, revealing the illuminated hospital complex in precisely the position she had described. Emergency Communications. How are you tracking our position so accurately? Our electrical systems are completely failed, and ground control radar has been intermittent for the past 30 minutes. Sarah's answer came with the confidence of someone who had trained for this exact scenario for 3 years. Life Flight 7. I'm using acoustic triangulation methods based on engine sound signatures and atmospheric propagation patterns. Your helicopter's turbine produces specific frequency signatures that can be tracked using specialized acoustic equipment during electromagnetic interference events. The explanation was so far outside conventional air traffic control procedures that experienced pilots began to realize they were receiving guidance from someone whose capabilities exceeded anything in standard aviation emergency protocols. But as aircraft after aircraft reported successful navigation using Sarah's instructions, questions about methodology became secondary to the results she was achieving. United Flight 1893 had been circling aimlessly for 40 minutes, burning fuel while its pilots attempted to resolve GPS conflicts that showed their aircraft at impossible locations. When Sarah's voice reached their cockpit, Captain David Kim felt a surge of hope that had been absent since the electromagnetic interference began. United 1893, this is emergency communications. You're currently at 39,000 feet, 23 miles east of Denver International Airport. Your autopilot disconnection issues are caused by conflicting GPS signals. Switch to manual flight controls and turn left heading 275 degrees. Begin descent to 15,000 feet at 1,500 feet per minute. Emergency communications, United 1893. How? Do you know about our autopilot issues? We haven't transmitted any details about our specific system failures. Sarah's response revealed capabilities that seemed to border on the supernatural to pilots who had spent their careers relying on electronic navigation systems. United 1893. Acoustic analysis of your engine pitch variations indicates irregular thrust adjustments consistent with autopilot disconnection cycles. Your aircraft is performing exactly as expected for a Boeing 737, experiencing GPS signal conflicts during electromagnetic interference events. In air traffic control facilities across the region, supervisors were making urgent phone calls to FAA headquarters, trying to understand how someone identified only as emergency communications specialist Chun was providing navigation guidance that exceeded the capabilities of their own radar systems. The name meant nothing to aviation professionals who had never heard of classified emergency communication protocols, but in a secure conference room at the FAA's Emergency Operations Center in Washington, D.C., Director James Sullivan was monitoring the Colorado crisis with full knowledge of who Sarah Chun was and what her training had prepared her to accomplish. As reports came in of successful aircraft guidance using methods that seemed impossible to conventional aviation professionals, he realized that 3 years of classified research was being validated under real-world conditions that no simulation could have replicated. "Sir," said technical analyst Jennifer Walsh, looking up from communication monitoring equipment that was tracking Sarah's transmissions, "we're receiving confirmations from 17 aircraft that have successfully navigated using guidance from this emergency communications specialist Chun. Her position assessments are accurate to within GPS precision levels, despite the fact that GPS systems are failing throughout the region." Director Sullivan activated a secure communication link to the Pentagon, knowing that what was happening in Colorado would require briefings for officials whose security clearances included knowledge of programs that existed beyond public awareness. Joint Chiefs Emergency Communications. This is FAA Director Sullivan. We have confirmed activation of specialized communication protocols that were previously theoretical. Results are exceeding all projected performance parameters. The response came from a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to managing military operations that operated outside normal command structures. "Director Sullivan, we're monitoring the situation. Can you confirm that the specialized asset is performing within acceptable operational security parameters?" "Affirmative. The asset is maintaining operational cover while providing emergency services that are saving lives in real time. We have 43 aircraft receiving guidance that conventional systems cannot provide." At Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, radar operators who monitored airspace for North American Aerospace Defense Command were witnessing something unprecedented in their experience. Master Sergeant Lisa Thompson had been tracking the electromagnetic interference event with equipment sensitive enough to detect atmospheric anomalies that civilian radar systems couldn't resolve. Colonel Martinez, she called to her commanding officer, "We're tracking acoustic emissions from the Red Rocks area that are showing propagation patterns consistent with long-range communication systems. But the signals are voice-generated, not electronic. Sir, someone is using human vocal frequencies to guide aircraft across a 3-state region." Colonel Robert Martinez approached the monitoring station with the expression of someone who had learned that military technology occasionally encountered phenomena that exceeded conventional understanding. "Sergeant Thompson, are you telling me that someone is talking to aircraft from Red Rocks and being heard clearly across hundreds of miles?" "Sir, the acoustic analysis shows voice frequencies that are being amplified by the natural rock formations at Red Rocks. The electromagnetic interference that's disabling electronic communications is also creating atmospheric conditions that allow certain vocal frequencies to propagate much farther than normal physics would predict." Colonel Martinez picked up a secure telephone that connected directly to NORAD's command center. "Command, this is Peterson Base. We need immediate classification review for acoustic phenomena occurring at Red Rocks Amphitheater. We may be witnessing the operational deployment of communication systems that fall under special access programs." The implications of what was happening began to ripple through military and aviation leadership as reports of Sarah's capabilities reached officials who had been briefed on theoretical emergency communication research but had never expected to see it deployed under operational conditions. The backup singer, whose existence was known only to a handful of people with appropriate security clearances, was demonstrating abilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about human communication limitations. Southwest Flight 2156 had been struggling with weather radar displays that showed impossible storm formations when Sarah's voice reached their cockpit with information that seemed to come from sources beyond conventional meteorological equipment. "Southwest 2156, this is emergency communications. The weather radar anomalies you're experiencing are caused by electromagnetic reflection patterns. The actual weather conditions at your current position are clear with light turbulence. Continue. Current heading 085 degrees. Maintain 37,000 feet. You'll clear the interference zone in approximately 14 minutes. Captain Angela Rodriguez, who had been flying commercial aircraft for 15 years, had never received weather information with such precision from any ground-based source. Emergency communications. How are you obtaining weather data that's more accurate than our onboard radar systems? Southwest 2156. I'm using acoustic analysis of atmospheric pressure variations, combined with electromagnetic interference pattern recognition. The storm system is creating predictable acoustic signatures that can be interpreted to determine actual weather conditions versus radar anomalies. The conversation was being monitored by meteorologists at the National Weather Service who realized they were hearing weather analysis techniques that didn't exist in any of their professional training programs. Dr. Vasquez, still monitoring the crisis from NCAR, understood that Sarah Chun was applying acoustic science principles to real-time weather analysis in ways that produced results more accurate than electronic instruments. As aircraft after aircraft reported successful navigation using Sarah's guidance, the aviation community began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of emergency communications. The backup singer, who had spent 3 years being dismissed as background support, was demonstrating capabilities that exceeded the performance of billion-dollar air traffic control systems. But perhaps the most profound recognition came from the pilots themselves. who began to understand that the voice guiding them through the electromagnetic chaos belonged to someone whose training and abilities existed far beyond anything they had encountered in their professional careers. The calm confidence in Sarah's voice, the precision of her instructions, and the accuracy of her information created a level of trust that transcended the normal relationship between pilots and ground control. Emergency communications. Came a transmission from Delta Flight 891. This is Captain Jennifer Hayes. On behalf of all the aircraft you're currently guiding, I want you to know that your voice is the most reassuring sound we've heard since this interference began. Whatever training prepared you for this, it's saving lives tonight. Sarah's response carried the quiet professionalism that had characterized all her transmissions, but for the first time, there was a note of personal acknowledgement in her voice. Delta 891, this is what I trained for. Let's get everyone home safely. The backup singer had stepped forward from the shadows, and the entire aviation world was listening. The true measure of Sarah Chun's capabilities revealed itself when Life Flight 7 approached Denver General Hospital with fuel reserves, measured in minutes rather than miles. Michael Chen, the helicopter pilot sharing her surname by coincidence, was flying a machine whose electrical systems had failed completely, leaving him with manual controls and a critically ill patient whose survival depended on reaching the hospital within a window that was closing with each passing second. Life Flight 7, this is emergency communications. Sarah's voice cut through the static with crystalline clarity. You're approaching the hospital complex from the southwest. I need you to adjust your approach path to compensate for wind shear that's developing along the building corridor. The electromagnetic interference is creating micro-pressure systems that will affect your rotor performance. Pilot Chun felt the helicopter respond to wind patterns that he couldn't see, but that Sarah was somehow tracking with precision that exceeded his onboard instruments. Emergency communications. How are you detecting wind shear patterns? We have no meteorological equipment functioning. Life Flight 7. I'm reading acoustic signatures from your rotor wash interacting with the hospital buildings. The sound reflection patterns indicate downdraft conditions along the eastern approach corridor. Adjust your heading 2 degrees left and increase your descent rate to 400 feet per minute. You'll encounter a thermal updraft in 30 seconds that will require forward cyclic pressure to maintain approach stability. The prediction proved accurate with mathematical precision. As Life Flight 7 descended toward the hospital helipad, the helicopter encountered the thermal updraft exactly when Sarah had predicted, requiring the precise control inputs she had described. Pilot Chun executed the landing with a smoothness that belied the fact that he was flying entirely on instruments that had failed 40 minutes earlier. Emergency communications. Life Flight 7 is on deck at Denver General. Patient is being transferred to trauma team. I don't know how you guided us through that approach with such precision, but you just saved a life tonight. But Sarah's most impressive demonstration of acoustic mastery came when Frontier Flight 558, a regional jet carrying 127 passengers, encountered severe turbulence that threatened to exceed the aircraft's structural limits. The electromagnetic interference had disabled the plane's weather radar, leaving Captain Lisa Wang flying blind through atmospheric conditions that were intensifying beyond anything in her 22 years of commercial aviation experience. Frontier 558, this is emergency communications. You're entering a severe turbulence zone that's developing due to electromagnetic pressure interactions. I need you to immediately climb to 41,000 feet and turn right heading 120 degrees. The turbulence will peak in 90 seconds and then clear rapidly. Captain Wang followed the instructions despite the fact that the altitude change required pushing her aircraft near its surface, sealing a decision that would normally require extensive consultation with dispatchers and meteorologists. But the electromagnetic interference had cut communications with her airline's operations center, leaving Sarah's voice as the only source of weather information. Emergency communications were climbing through 39,000 feet. The turbulence is severe, but it seems to be decreasing as we climb. How are you tracking atmospheric conditions with such accuracy? Sarah's explanation revealed the depth of her acoustic analysis capabilities in ways that impressed even experienced pilots, who thought they understood the limits of atmospheric science. Frontier 558. I'm analyzing the harmonic frequencies generated by your engines interacting with pressure differentials in the atmosphere. The electromagnetic interference is creating acoustic windows that allow me to detect pressure variations across a three-dimensional atmospheric grid. Your current position is moving through a pressure gradient that will stabilize at 41,000 feet. The turbulence cleared exactly as Sarah had predicted, leaving Frontier 558 flying in smooth air while aircraft at lower altitudes continued to report severe atmospheric disturbances. Captain Wang's passengers, who had been gripping their armrests during the climb, experienced the sudden transition to stable flight with the relief of people who had just survived something genuinely dangerous. Sarah's most technically challenging guidance came when Express Air Flight 334, a small commuter aircraft with only basic navigation equipment, found itself completely lost after its GPS system began displaying coordinates that placed the aircraft over the Atlantic Ocean while flying above Colorado. Captain Robert Kim had been relying on visual landmarks when clouds obscured the ground, leaving him with no reliable method for determining his position. Express Air 334, this is emergency communications. You're currently 47 miles east of Denver International Airport, flying at 8,200 feet on a heading that will take you into controlled airspace around Buckley Air Force Base. You need to turn left immediately, heading 285 degrees and climb to 10,500 feet. Emergency communications. Our instruments show us nowhere near military airspace. Are you certain about our position? Sarah's response demonstrated acoustic tracking capabilities that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of human sensory perception. Express Air 334. I'm tracking your aircraft using engine acoustic signatures that are reflecting off terrain features below you. Your single-engine Cessna produces specific propeller harmonic frequencies that create acoustic footprints on the Faikung landscape. You're currently flying over the South Platte River Valley, approximately 3 miles south of Bennett, Colorado. Captain Kim looked down through a brief break in the clouds and saw the river system exactly where Sarah had described it. The landmark confirmation provided absolute verification that her acoustic tracking methods were producing results more accurate than his malfunctioning GPS system. Emergency communications, that's incredible. You're tracking us using sound alone, and you're more accurate than our navigation instruments. The most demanding test of Sarah's capabilities occurred when multiple aircraft converged on Denver International Airport simultaneously, creating a traffic management challenge that would have strained air traffic control systems even under normal conditions. With electromagnetic interference disrupting radar coverage and radio communications, Sarah found herself coordinating the approaches of 7 aircraft using only acoustic analysis and her understanding of three-dimensional airspace management. Atlantic 447, United 1893, Southwest 2156. This is emergency communications. I'm going to sequence your approaches to Denver International Airport using time-based separation. Atlantic 447, continue descent to 8,000 feet, reduce speed to 180 knots. United 1893, maintain current altitude and speed for 2 minutes, then begin descent. Southwest 2156, extend your current heading for 5 minutes before turning toward the airport. the precision required to coordinate multiple aircraft approaches using voice communication alone exceeded anything in standard air traffic control procedures. Sarah was essentially conducting an aerial orchestra, with each aircraft representing an instrument that required precise timing and positioning to create a safe and efficient landing sequence. Emergency communications. This is Tower Chief Rodriguez at Denver International. Came a transmission from the airport's control tower. We're tracking the aircraft you're sequencing, and your separation standards are maintaining safe intervals despite our limited radar coverage. How are you calculating approach timing without electronic distance measuring equipment? Sarah's answer revealed the mathematical complexity underlying her acoustic analysis methods. Denver Tower, I'm using time differential acoustic analysis to calculate aircraft speeds and distances. By measuring the Doppler shift in engine frequencies and correlating that data with atmospheric propagation delays, I can determine precise positions and closure rates for multiple aircraft simultaneously. The technique was so far beyond conventional air traffic control methods that Rodriguez realized he was witnessing the practical application of acoustic science principles that existed years ahead of current aviation technology. Sarah was essentially using the Red Rocks amphitheater as a natural radar system, with her trained ear serving as the processor for acoustic data that electronic systems couldn't interpret. As each aircraft touched down safely at Denver International Airport, pilots who had been flying blind through electromagnetic interference began to understand that they had received guidance from someone whose capabilities represented a fusion of human performance and acoustic science that exceeded the boundaries of conventional aviation support. The final demonstration of Sarah's mastery came when she simultaneously guided 3 aircraft through critical phases of flight while maintaining communication with emergency services on the ground. Her voice never wavered, her instructions remained precise, and her acoustic analysis continued to produce navigation information that proved more reliable than billion-dollar electronic systems that had been defeated by atmospheric conditions. Backup singer had stepped forward to demonstrate that human capabilities, properly trained and applied, could exceed the performance of sophisticated technology when those systems encountered conditions beyond their design parameters. Sarah Chun had proven that 3 years of classified training could produce results that saved lives in ways that no electronic system could replicate. 6 hours after the last aircraft touched down safely at Denver International Airport, Sarah Chun sat alone on the Red Rock stage, her voice hoarse from 4 hours of continuous emergency communications that had guided 43 aircraft through the worst electromagnetic interference event in aviation history. The storm had moved eastward into Kansas, leaving behind clear skies and a silence that felt profound after the chaos of the night. Her specialized headset lay beside her, its classified electronics finally quiet after a night that had transformed theoretical emergency protocols into operational reality. The backup singer who had spent 3 years being overlooked by the music industry had become the primary voice that prevented what could have been the deadliest aviation disaster in American history. The transformation began immediately. By dawn, every major news network was reporting on the mystery voice that had guided aircraft through impossible weather conditions. While Sarah's identity remained classified, recordings of her communications with pilots had been released by the FAA as examples of exceptional emergency response procedures under unprecedented conditions. Dr. Eleanor Vasquez was among the first to arrive at Red Rocks, her official capacity as NCAR atmospheric physicist, providing cover for a conversation that touched on classified subjects. She found Sarah sitting in the natural amphitheater where acoustic science had merged with human performance to create something that exceeded the boundaries of both disciplines. The atmospheric data we collected tonight will reshape how we think about emergency communications, Dr. Vasquez said, settling onto the stone seating near the stage. Your voice carried across distances that should have been impossible, even accounting for the acoustic properties of this formation. Sarah managed a tired smile, her voice reduced to a whisper after hours of projecting frequencies that had reached aircraft hundreds of miles away. The training prepared me for the technical aspects, but nothing could have prepared me for the emotional weight of knowing that people's lives depended on every word I spoke. The media coverage expanded throughout the morning as aviation professionals realized they had witnessed something unprecedented. Captain Rebecca Torres of Atlantic Airways Flight 447 gave an interview that crystallized what many pilots were feeling. That voice didn't just guide us through a storm. It gave us confidence when our instruments were lying to us. Whoever that person is, they saved not just our aircraft but our careers. We would have been flying blind without those communications. The Federal Aviation Administration announced an immediate review of emergency communication protocols, with Director Sullivan stating that the previous night's events had demonstrated capabilities that exceed our current understanding of human performance in emergency situations. While the classified nature of Sarah's training prevented detailed public disclosure, the results spoke for themselves. 0 casualties, 0 incidents, 43 successful emergency landings. But perhaps the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source. Madison Williams, the headliner who had fled to her tour bus at the first sign of weather, returned to Red Rocks that morning to find her backup singer being interviewed by federal officials and atmospheric scientists. The dynamic between them had shifted completely. Madison was no longer the center of attention, and Sarah was no longer invisible. "I had no idea," Madison said, approaching Sarah with an expression that mixed embarrassment with genuine respect. "All this time, I thought you were just... I never realized you had this kind of training. The way those pilots were talking about you on the news, they're calling you a hero." Sarah's response carried the same quiet professionalism that had characterized her emergency communications. "I was just doing what I trained for, Madison. Sometimes the most important work happens when no one's watching." The music industry's reaction revealed how completely Sarah's role had been misunderstood. Tommy Rivera, the tour's musical director, who had dismissed her technical knowledge, found himself explaining to reporters why he hadn't recognized the expertise of someone who had been working alongside him for 3 years. "Sarah always knew more about sound engineering than seemed normal for a backup singer," he admitted during a CNN interview. "But we thought it was just academic interest, not this, not emergency communication skills that could save hundreds of lives." The other backup singers, Jessica Park, Amanda Foster, and Carla Martinez, struggled with the revelation that their colleague had been leading a double life of extraordinary complexity. Jessica's interview with Rolling Stone captured their collective bewilderment. "We shared hotel rooms with her for 3 years. She seemed like the most normal person on the tour. Quiet, professional, always prepared. Now we find out she was secretly trained to be some kind of human GPS system for aircraft emergencies." The Colorado School of Mines announced the establishment of the Chun Institute for Applied Acoustic Sciences, a research facility dedicated to exploring the practical applications of human vocal capabilities in emergency communication scenarios. Dr. Harrison, Sarah's former instructor, would direct research into expanding the acoustic communication protocols that had proven so effective during the key electromagnetic interference event. Sarah Chun has demonstrated that human performance, when properly trained and applied, can exceed the capabilities of electronic systems under specific conditions, Dr. Harrison explained during the Institute's announcement. "This opens up entirely new fields of research into emergency communications that could revolutionize how we handle disasters when conventional technology fails." The Pentagon's response remained largely classified, but senior military officials acknowledged that the previous night's events had validated research into alternative communication methodologies that would enhance national security capabilities during electronic warfare scenarios. Sarah's demonstration that human-generated communications could penetrate electromagnetic interference had implications far beyond civilian aviation. Airlines began immediate reviews of their emergency procedures, with several major carriers announcing partnerships with research institutions to develop enhanced communication protocols based on the techniques Sarah had demonstrated. The International Air Transport Association established a committee to study human-centric emergency communications with recommendations for implementation across global aviation networks, but the most profound impact occurred at the personal level, among the pilots and passengers whose lives had been touched by Sarah's voice during their most vulnerable moments. Captain Michael Chun of Life Flight 7 started a foundation supporting research into emergency medical transport communications, specifically citing the acoustic guidance techniques that had enabled his fuel-critical landing. A week after the storm, Sarah returned to the stage at Red Rocks for a concert that was unlike any in the venue's history. Madison Williams had restructured the entire show to feature Sarah as co-headliner, acknowledging that her backup singer deserved recognition that went far beyond the music industry. Tonight, we're honored to share the stage with someone who proved that the most powerful instrument isn't electronic, it's the human voice. Properly trained and courageously applied, Madison announced to an audience that included many of the pilots Sarah had guided through the storm. The performance took on deeper meaning as Sarah's voice filled the natural amphitheater where she had spent a night using acoustic science to save lives. Her singing demonstrated the same technical precision and emotional depth that had characterized her emergency communications. But now the audience understood they were hearing something extraordinary. Among the crowd were federal officials, research scientists, aviation professionals, and ordinary people who had been inspired by the story of a backup singer whose hidden expertise had prevented tragedy on an unprecedented scale. The applause that greeted her performance carried recognition that transcended entertainment. It was acknowledgement of human potential that had been realized under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. As the concert ended and the Q&A de Consalve had been realized under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. As the concert ending circumstances imaginable. As the concert ended, audience dispersed into the Colorado night. Sarah remained on the stage where her life had changed forever. The backup singer had stepped forward from the shadows not by seeking attention, but by being prepared when reality demanded excellence that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional capability. Her story became a symbol for hidden potential. Everywhere for the overlooked employees whose expertise goes unrecognized, for the quiet professionals whose capabilities exceed their visible roles, for anyone who has been underestimated while preparing for the moment when their true abilities would be needed most. The backup singer had found her voice, and in doing so, had saved hundreds of lives while demonstrating that excellence doesn't wait for recognition, it simply remains ready for the moment when preparation meets the urgent need for extraordinary performance. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.